Hi, everybody. Tonight we are going to be discussing the components of assessment in AAC. Now, we've already discussed communicative competence and defining levels of functioning, but the information we discuss in this lecture is really meant to provide a general overview of the AAC assessment process. You certainly should use the information that we explored with communicative competence and defining levels of functioning, in addition to perhaps any standardized tests, where you might be seeing a patient whose particular diagnosis may warrant that, or thinking about different facilities and how they often have their own assessment procedures. So we'll get started here. First, talking about the AAC team, who is involved. The AAC team always involves the individual in need of AAC or our AAC user. Communication partners are also very beneficial. They offer a unique perspective into the strengths and communication breakdown. And keep in mind that a communication partner does not always have to be a family member. It can be a friend, a neighbor, an aide. It's really someone who knows the person in need of AAC and who can take responsibility for helping with communication access. It's important to note that the person in need of AAC or our client should always be at the center of decision making to the greatest extent possible. So we often consider what their life participation goals are. That's what I have up here on the board, and then you'll see also next to that is LPAA. LPAA stands for the Life Participation Approach to Aphasia, but I do think it is a guiding philosophy that we can apply to many different individuals, not just those who have aphasia. Basically, it's that the person affected, the person with the condition needing the treatment should be at the center of all decision making. And I could give you some examples from my own practice of life participation goals that somebody indicates, because they can be small and simple, and they don't always have to be related to communication in order for us to highly consider them and even assess for the ability to get the patient there. So my first example is I was working with a woman whose life participation goal was to visit her daughter. But her daughter had many, many steps leading into the home, and that was a barrier that we couldn't quite address in speech therapy. But we did incorporate components to make visiting her daughter easier and kind of get her back to where she once was as far as visiting her. So we utilized her AAC system so that she could call her daughter and remind her that she was visiting, let her know that she was going to be leaving her home in about 5 minutes or so, just kind of giving her daughter the heads up, which is completely normal. That's what we do. That's normal communication. Before we go to someone's home, we just remind them, hey, I'm going to be getting on the road in a little bit and I'll see you soon. So again, the goal she indicated was not necessarily communication based, but we are able to thread communication and support that goal in any event. So these goals can also be a lot bigger. We've heard many clients say that they just want to get back out into the community. They just want to get back to work. So we can just use those goals as the focus of our treatment, the focus of our assessment as well. And just figuring out which AAC system am I going to assess for, what skills does this client have so that we can make that goal possible. Now, the AAC assessment, simply put, really is just an evaluation or reviewing all the ways that a person currently communicates and help provide ideas for enhancing that communication. So on the most basic level, that's really what we're doing. Now, the first thing we want to consider is kind of making an informed decision about the adequacy of their current communication strategies. Basically, what's working and what's not working. Is the current communication adequate for the patient or person across all contexts? Is it functional? So these are the kind of questions we want to be asking, probing for, and observing. We also want to establish current and future communication needs and goals. Again, that will be really helpful in determining which type of system or which type of strategy is going to be best. We also want to brainstorm which AAC technique is going to be most appropriate, again, to help the person achieve those goals that they indicated. So if we use my example about my client wanting to visit her daughter, in this case, a low-tech board, okay, was not going to be the best fit because in order to call her daughter and for her daughter to hear her message clearly, she needed speech output, which leads us to a high-tech device. So again, we use these goals to help us with the assessment process. We also need to think about how we are going to provide instruction on the best AAC strategy. Sometimes people need the education first. Why AAC? Sometimes we need to debunk myths, which we will get to later in this course. But someone is just unsure, not motivated, afraid to try an AAC system or strategy because of misinformation. You might also want to think, are you going to model the AAC system? Is this a person that just needs some cueing? Or are you going to do step-by-step incremental, in increments, the training piece? Okay, and then lastly, we just need to evaluate all of our outcomes. So there are different components to an AAC system that we have to consider during assessment. There's primary, secondary, and tertiary components. We'll start with primary, and those are any component that performs the functions of natural language. Okay, so think symbols and vocabulary. Those have the greatest impact on communication performance. So icons, all of that. Now, secondary components are related to how an individual uses and interacts with the system. So think more here, alternative access, accessories for high-tech systems, perhaps the user interface, how are they interacting with the system? Does it need to be simplified with less icons, or do we need to customize with more icons? And even think about the output. Does the sound need to be amplified? Do they need speech output, like my example that I gave about my client wanting to visit her daughter? So all important pieces to that secondary component. Now the tertiary component is often external to the system itself, but it does affect long-term use and ongoing success with the system. So think here, how portable are these systems for our users? Analyzing kind of a person's lifestyle. I know I worked with a lot of clients who take public transportation, so they're on and off the bus or the train, and they needed something very lightweight. They needed something discreet. So that's kind of where that comes in. Okay, so as far as assessment tools, we certainly have informal assessment tools, and then we have a bit more formal tools, one of which I have linked for you guys to review. Informal assessment tool, basically observation of the client in their natural communication environment. We're really looking to see, is this person able to participate in conversation fully? What are the barriers to the person using their device effectively? Is it opportunity? So thinking about communication partners and perhaps not quite knowing how to facilitate conversation. Do they just not have easy access to their system? I mean, is it somewhere up high on a shelf where they can't access? So things along those lines. Now, we also want to think about the client having sufficient positioning and sufficient motor skills, sensory perceptual skills to utilize a device. Now, a lot of times we get help from our OT and PT friends about positioning and motor skills and all of that. But it's certainly important to observe and take note of. Now, the inch I was able to get from ASHA's website. So again, I've linked that there. That is the interaction checklist for augmentative communication, and it's been revised. The TASP, however, so the Test of Aided Communication Symbol Performance, is actually an assessment that you can purchase. So I wanted to give you guys a brief description of what that is. I mean, it's basically designed for use by people with cognitive communication or speech conditions or impairments. It's a test of symbolic skills, and it provides a good starting point for designing or selecting an appropriate page set for an AAC device. The great thing is the test can also be used to help you design communication boards. Okay, so it's really just about assessing the symbols, right? So somebody's ability to understand and utilize symbols for communication. Now, the results can also help in establishing appropriate AAC intervention goals and strategies that target symbolic and syntactic development. So it's certainly a wonderful assessment, but again, for purchase. So feel free to Google and read a bit more about it. I took that summary and wanted to give you guys a little bit of background. So a little bit more of a formal assessment tool than just observation. Just a few more points on symbol assessment, just to kind of clarify anything in that past slide. Symbol assessment, we're really looking at the person's ability to use various symbol features and how might that meet their current and future communication needs. So different things that we look at is basically the type of symbol. This is a bit of a review, but with symbols, obviously, we can have actual photographs, or does a person need physical objects? How does a person do with just letters versus printed text? Symbol size is important as well. You can enlarge symbols. You can make them much smaller. With field size, we're looking to see, is a client able to make a choice out of, 8 symbols, or do they need much less? So the number of symbols in a display is important to kind of assess someone's skills. And of course, organization. Is a person able to attend to all the symbols in the way that they're organized, okay? Or do we need to organize all the way to the right or all the way to the left? Sometimes we need to do that when there's a visual field cut, for example. So that's a little bit more about the symbol assessment. Now, we always want to obtain a case history. I think this is really across the board and not just in AAC assessment. But we want to consider medical status and history, education, occupation, cultural linguistic backgrounds are important to note too. One thing though, it will be important to consider if there has been a history with any other AAC systems, or is there current use of a system. We really want to look at, first of all, if someone's currently using a system, is it successful? If not, what are the pain points? And thinking about maybe the history where somebody did once use an AAC system, you'd want to be curious and explore further of why, what was it, a device abandonment, which is a term you'll hear in our field. But basically, as it sounds, they abandoned their device and they did not use it, or they abandoned their system, I should say. Lastly, we'll want to consider prognosis and whether or not their condition is going to progress. And that's just so that we can plan ahead. We might need to consider a system that we have the ability to attach accessories such as eye gaze if we know a person might progress to the point where they're not able to physically or directly select icons with their hands, right? They might lose that motor ability. So kind of planning for the future there. So a little bit more on assessing current communication. It's important to keep in mind that everyone communicates in some way. It can be nonverbal or unaided, such as facial expressions or head nodding and all of that. But we really want to determine the effectiveness of whatever their current communication strategy is. So oftentimes, we see, oh, well, so-and-so's nonverbal. And they're nonverbal if they're not using natural speech. That is just a term that we use in our field. But we want to go a bit further than that. Well, how are they indicating pain, happiness, when they're agreeing, when they're protesting? And how effective is that? Is that just effective with familiar partners that kind of know their routine? What context does that not serve them as well? And we want to think about also people that might use, say, writing, pen and paper, something that is low tech, right? It still requires a tool. What are the barriers or limitations to that current ability? Well, one case for just using pen and paper would be if that person actually wanted to kind of use the phone or go out there into the community, and then therefore they always have to have access to pen and paper. And of course, writing down your messages takes a bit more time than just accessing icons. So again, just identifying those and making sure to have a conversation about the limitations of what they're currently using. And a lot of times we just want to ask ourselves and consider, how can we just augment the current strategies? Just providing an additional tool. So we're not saying to somebody, hey, never use your pen and paper again. But we're just saying, hey, in addition to the pen and paper, here is, this option, this system. And oftentimes there are high-tech systems that also have a whiteboard on them so that you can kind of carry over that comfortable system that they have with writing on pen and paper, for example, but now you also have access and we're augmenting and just enhancing what is there. Now, the self-report is always wonderful if we are able to get some information here. I know from experience that it can be a challenge to get some really good content, especially if somebody is significantly impaired. But when we are able to, we want to know, where does one feel successful? And then to the contrary, where is there most difficulty? And how does that impact the person? How does that impact their family? We certainly want to look at all the different contexts of concern. So is it social interactions? Is it a noisy restaurant? Is it work activities? When we think about children and students, is it at school? Is it on the playground? We want to look at the language and languages used in those different contexts. So this becomes especially interesting and important when you're working with clients who are bilingual. You certainly want to know if they're using a particular or their native language at home, but then when they leave the home, they're finding more difficulty, say using English on their device or on their system. It's just something that we want to keep in mind and plan for. And then, of course, as we mentioned, it's always important to consider an individual's goals and preferences. Okay, just a bit about the spoken language assessment. We are just basically assessing for expressive and receptive skills. We want to know if somebody has communicative intent. Are they, using their expressive skills to ask a question, or are they trying to respond? Is there intent there? We also look at the current means of communication and their effectiveness, and that could be verbal or nonverbal. It's kind of a review of what we just said. We also want to look at a person's vocabulary size and the word types that they're using. We also want to consider the word combinations and if there are grammatical forms in place. Now, this is kind of where that receptive piece comes in. So the ability to follow commands, the ability to respond to yes/no questions, the ability to identify objects, words, and pictures. So are they able to point to the objects, words, and pictures? That's some of the parts and pieces of the assessment. Now, it's also important to take a look at reading and writing skills. I think that really helps us determine which system might be best or how we might need to customize and personalize a system to suit somebody's skills. So as far as reading and writing skills, I am not going to dive too far into the different levels. We just know that there is an emergent level, early elementary level, and then there's the later elementary level and above. When it comes to adults or people with acquired communication impairments, we're really looking at their premorbid skills, number one. So what was their literacy level prior to the onset of their impairment? Were they somebody that could read and write? And then what is their current ability? So, is this adult I'm working with, is he or she able to read at 1-word level, 2-word level, or not at all? Now, with the cognitive communication assessment, we're really looking here at attention, memory, problem solving, and executive skills in the context of using an AAC functionally. So do they remember where that symbol is located to say good morning, when they wake up? Do they have the attention skills to learn how to use an AAC system? And problem solving comes in many different forms and fashions as you're, functionally using an AAC device. But where are they currently at? Sometimes you just establish a baseline and then, of course, you just kind of train from there. It doesn't mean that if somebody has poor memory or poor attention that they should not receive a type of system. It just means that's where we should really spend some time training. Now, the feature matching assessment, I took this from ASHA. I think this is a really lovely summary here of the different features that you want to think about and you want to go through, and then you match with a particular system. So, for example, we'll start with the capability to allow a range of communication functions. Now, if this is a feature that somebody needs, okay, the ability to utilize this device in a restaurant, over the phone, asking questions, requesting, so those are the different communication functions, then we need to feature match and perhaps set them up with a higher tech system. Or, if they're going to use a low-tech system, we can't just give them a single, board, a one-pager of different symbols. They're going to need something that allows them this range of access to different symbols for those different communication functions. Now, next, the capacity for use in varying environments and with different partners. So if somebody is using an unaided or a low-tech strategy, but they're not able to bring this, out into a noisier environment, or utilize their current strategy over the phone, again, we want to feature match there. Type and number of symbols. So just exploring, Does this person require a lot of symbols because perhaps there's somebody that wants to get back into the, you know, employment arena, get back to work, and therefore they're going to need access to a lot of vocabulary? Or is this a student that is going to need a lot of symbols to interact in the classroom? Well, then we might need to look at systems that allow for that. And there are a lot of systems out there that have different types of symbols. So there's Unity language systems that really help with literacy and language development. It has all the core words that a student might need. Okay, whereas somebody else might require a different type of symbol. I know that people who have acquired impairments such as aphasia really don't do well with that Unity type symbol. They don't need all of those core words. In fact, oftentimes those types of clients, they don't speak in grammatical sentences. Those prepositions, small articles of speech are difficult for them to comprehend. So we're looking at a much different system for them based on this feature matching assessment than with a student that is going to want to work on that language development and grammatically correct sentences and literacy and so on and so forth. Okay, the type of display and display features. So we know that there are static displays and there are dynamic displays. Dynamic displays are going to be like the iPads and the speech generating devices, where you click on a page or an icon, it opens up or it interacts with you. So the screen is dynamic. Static kind of stays the same. There are hybrid models. There's color, there's black and white. Sometimes the color scheme or the black and white really speaks more to someone's visual ability. So sometimes visual impairments require somebody to have a certain color scheme or theme to help identify icons and contrast and whatnot. Now, the input type, do they need direct selection or indirect selection? Output is important. So going back to my example about my client earlier, she really needed that speech or that voice output. And on certain systems, they have the ability to have a male voice, a female voice. Do we need a child's voice? So feature matching. Physical positioning, need for accessories, so mounts and switches. That's important. If you're working with somebody who is going to need a mount or a switch, then perhaps you should not use a low-tech system and you should look at a high-tech system that can be mounted or that can be connected to a switch. Portability is very important. So there are some devices out there that are bigger and bulkier than others. There are some that are more discreet. There are some that you can download on your phone as an app, and there are some systems that you can have on an iPad. So portability is definitely something to consider. Capability to modify or allow for changes in communication abilities and needs. This is important because when it comes to customizing a system, I always believe that our lives in general are just forever evolving and changing. And what was important to you 5 years ago might still be important, but might not be important anymore. You know, we gain friends, we lose friends, and I think that systems that, you know, we can modify and can allow for changes in our abilities and our needs. It's really important to teach our clients to be able to do it, and also to make sure that the system that they're using is easy enough for them to do that. Ability to motivate use by individuals. So basically this is just speaking towards motivation. Is the person excited with the system that they're using, or are they not? You know, I really think that low-tech systems are wonderful for some people, but they're not easily customized and they don't have the voice output. So sometimes we see a little bit of lack of motivation there. And lastly, affordability, ease of maintenance. So we want to see, is a high-tech system affordable for somebody? Can we get it funded through insurance? Not everybody can afford an iPad or even a smartphone to download an app. So we certainly have to consider that during our assessment. Now, this is just to say that there are facilitators and there are barriers during this process. So a facilitator is going to be anything that facilitates AAC systems. So a person's ability and willingness to use a system, their family support, their motivation to communicate, if they are technologically savvy and they feel comfortable with using a dynamic display or using technology in general, that is considered a facilitator. But barriers we often see, even just during this assessment part of the process before we even get into implementing a system. But these barriers can just be, reduced confidence. A lot of times people with acquired conditions just have lost their confidence. They're still trying to accept their condition, what has happened to them. Cognitive deficits are certainly a barrier. Visual and motor impairments can create barriers for us. Lack of acceptance of the disability or needing to use AAC. So sometimes with those degenerative or progressive diseases, it takes a long time to get to the point of accepting that they need to use an AAC system. So the earlier we can get in there with some good education and introducing AAC, the better. Limitations in the capability of the AAC system, seating and positioning, and of course, just limitations across environments. These are just a few more general areas that we look at. So we've already discussed very briefly kind of that physical access. Does someone need something mounted? Do they need alternative access? So think back to our head mouse and our eye gaze and all of that. When it comes to the visual impairments, we look at visual acuity, visual processing, and that visual contrast sensitivity. So that's really thinking about the color schemes and themes of the device. A lot of devices, you are able to play around a bit with the background color. So it just a lot of times makes the icons easier to identify. I might have mentioned this earlier, I'm not sure, but you might also have to consider aligning all the icons either to the right or to the left if there is a visual field cut. So this is certainly an area to assess and to see if there is any sort of neglect or visual field cut. You want to identify different types and fonts of symbols and words and see what somebody does better with. You want to assess if somebody is able to categorize. If they're not, then you have to, think about organizing the system in a different way instead of categorization. Word picture matching, that's certainly helpful, right? When there is a word or written word underneath an image, if somebody is able to identify that word belongs with that picture. Reading and spelling. So this again goes to that thought, am I going to recommend a text-to-speech, a keyboard, an alphabet-based system, or am I not? And just, a person's ability to focus their thoughts and communicate in general. Okay, we're really coming to the end here. So I generally get a lot of questions about speech generating devices because there is a whole assessment and there are considerations that are kind of exclusive to speech generating devices that are covered by insurance companies. You know, they're funded by those different plans. So I thought I would just spend a minute or two going through this. If anyone is very interested in diving deeper with me, we can certainly do that. But just for everybody here to know that SGDs, or speech generating devices, are considered durable medical equipment by many insurance plans. So Medicare, Medicaids, private insurances, even, well, certainly VA facilities cover speech generating devices. Actually, I shouldn't confuse you by saying the VA, because they actually don't require this assessment piece. So just know that the VA funds speech generating devices, but this isn't necessarily required there. But so in order for the device to be funded or covered by insurance, a clinician has to determine and justify through their assessment that the device is a medical necessity. So what does that exactly mean? Well, for one thing, the communication impairment must be at least moderate severe, just exactly as it's written. Sometimes I say moderately severe so we don't get confused. Moderate is not allowed unless the diagnosis is progressive or degenerative, so we're expecting a decline over time. So sometimes that gets a little bit confusing. So moderately severe is what is considered a medical necessity, unless we're talking about ALS, primary apraxia of primary progressive apraxia of speech, or primary progressive aphasia of speech. Again, just a condition that we're expecting a decline over time. Now, we also have to determine that natural speech and language is not functional. We have to give some information there. We also have to talk about the prognosis without an SGD. So if a person was not to use a speech generating device, what does prognosis look like? And that actually has to be deemed poor. We have to rule out other forms of AAC and treatment methods. So basically just describing to insurance companies and our medical necessity about why a low-tech option by itself would not be sufficient for this particular patient. I don't want to confuse everybody, because I think that systems really should not be considered in a vacuum. I don't think that you should just exclusively use a high-tech system and not consider, say, a communication book as a backup. But this is really speaking to, well, why is a communication book not sufficient in and of itself? Okay, and sometimes, you know, reasons listed there that it's limiting, it does not have the voice output, and a particular client or person does well with repetition, you know, repeating after they hear the icon out loud. So that's why a low-tech option doesn't offer that. Some people you know, write that the device allows them to practice kind of therapeutically outside of speech therapy, which is certainly true. You know, you have that nice model there to repeat after once you hear the word. And lastly, we really have to discuss how we observe the device used functionally, just justifying why it's clinically appropriate. Now, there are other parts and pieces, but these are kind of the primary parts that insurance companies really look at. Most frequently asked questions I put here up for you guys. So I'm certainly looking forward to hearing more from you in the discussion forum. And please let me know if you have any questions about the content we've gone over thus far. I'm happy to meet with anybody, you know, either via Zoom, okay, that's the video conferencing that we can use, or by phone call. So let me know, and we will all speak soon. Thanks so much.